Hi, my name is Francisco, and I have a few suggestions on how you can write the introduction chapter of your thesis or dissertation. So the first thing to keep in mind is, what is the purpose of this chapter? It has to be clear for you, what is the purpose of it? And as the name shockingly suggests, the main purpose is for you to introduce the topic for the reader. So what does that mean exactly? That means showing what is the context of your study and why that's important and to whom it's going to benefit. What are your personal motivations? In other words, why is this topic relevant for you individually? Your aims and your objectives. In other words, what exactly you're going to do step by step in your work. And finally, the structure of your thesis. So what would the reader find in the following chapters? So let's discuss now one by one of these topics. So the first point is your actual introduction. And keep in mind that this is the longest part of this chapter, okay? So what I always suggest my students is to start writing this chapter with something catchy. It can be a quote, a relevant quote. It can be a question. It can be a case from the industry. Something that highlights or that brings the attention of the reader for your topic. Because what you need to keep in mind is that not necessarily the reader will know much about your context. For example, let me give you two examples. Imagine that you're writing about the implementation of facial recognition technologies in music festivals, or you are discussing the implementation of virtual reality in education, for example. What would the reader know about facial recognition technologies and also about music festivals? Maybe they know a lot, maybe they know nothing. If you're writing about virtual reality and the implementation of VR in education, what would the reader know about these two contexts? But you have to finish reading this section of introduction, which is your first point, and have a good idea about what this topic is about. And how do you do that? You do that by explaining basic concepts. For example, if you're talking about facial recognition, what is facial recognition technologies? When did it start? Is it a recent thing? Is it an old thing? The same thing for virtual reality, the same thing if you're talking about electric cars, if you're talking about smartphones, if you're discussing robots or whatever topic that you're talking about, yeah? Another thing that you can do is you can give a lot of examples of the main stakeholders. So who are the main players? What are the main brands? What are the main companies? What are successful cases of your context? What are controversial situations that have happened? And while doing so, you have to highlight why that is important and to whom that's going to benefit. Yeah. So what is the contribution of your work for the industry or also for academia? And while you are writing on this section and trying to bring industry data, make sure that you're citing relevant and reliable sources. And that's extremely important throughout your entire work. You have to use reliable sources. Now, in your introduction, the introduction only, and at least that's my personal suggestions for my students, you can use, or I tell them that it's okay for them to use, sources such as consulting companies, reliable sources like United Nations, or even some commercial sources like The Economist or the New York Times, for example. And then you can finish this section by highlighting what you're trying to achieve. After you finish contextualizing your work, the next step for you to do is your personal motivation. And that can be a subtopic, for example, like a 1.1. And this is a very short section. Usually 1 or 2 paragraphs will be enough. And at least for me, I tell my students that it's okay for them to write in first person. And this is a moment that you tell the reader why this topic is relevant for you. In other words, why did you get there? So it's okay for you to write in first person. Keep it short, yeah, 1 or 2 paragraphs maximum. And tell them, be honest, why is that relevant for you? But just one suggestion here, in case your supervisor suggested the topic for you, or in case this is a topic that is involved in your research group, don't tell the reader that. Just focus on why that's relevant for you. After you introduce and contextualize your study and you wrote about your personal motivations, the following topic, which could be your 1.2, that would be your aims and your objectives. And this is something that requires a bit more detail. There's another video for that that you will find here in the descriptions. But this is a really important, yeah. So make sure that you highlight your aim. Usually the actual sentence of your aim, you can write that in, or you can mark it in italics, for example. That has to be really clear for the reader, because also one of the things I do when I'm reviewing the work from students is, one of the very first things is I look, what did you say you were going to do and what did you actually do? So one of the first things I do is I really quickly, I just go into the aims of the students. What did they say they were going to do? Go to the results really quickly. What did they say? What did they actually do? And see if there's a matching between those two. So make sure that your aims and your objectives are really, really clear. And lastly, the final thing of this chapter is the structure of your thesis. And that's where you tell the reader what the reader will find in the following chapters, in your literature review, in your methodology, in your results, in your conclusion, in your limitations, and so on. So these are my tips. The first thing is contextualize. Tell the reader why your work is important. Make sure to support it with industry data, lots of examples. Explain basic concepts in relation to your context. Following that, to tell the reader what is your personal motivation. It's okay if you write it in first person, at least for me. Then after that, you're going to tell the reader about your aims and your objectives. And this is a really important part because that's the essence of what your work is about. And finally, the structure of your thesis. And just one final thing in relation to the structure of the thesis. Usually I tell my students, leave that for the last thing for you to write. Don't write it in the beginning because the structure will change anyway. So leave it as one of the final things for you to write about. Yeah, so these were my suggestions for you. All of this information, don't forget, there's a full article that I wrote, which is also in the description of this video. There's also a PDF there that you can download and take it with you. These are my suggestions, yeah, so every supervisor, they have different expectations. So don't forget to discuss all of these things with your supervisor. Don't take just my word. And just one final thing, instead of liking, subscribing, all these things that, people on YouTube ask you all the time, instead of doing that, have a nice beer and listen to one song from Bob Dylan called "It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding." It's a great song by an absolute legend. All the absolute best, my friend, and take care.